The Billionaire and the Single Dad. The little girl's spoon slipped from her fingers and cracked against the polished marble floor. Every head in the glass-walled executive dining room turned, but 6-year-old Lily Cross didn't seem to notice. Her face had gone pale and still, her eyes locked on the exhausted man standing near the doorway in a faded blue shirt, clutching a worn folder to his chest while security moved in to walk him out. Moments earlier, her mother, billionaire CEO Vivian Cross, had turned down his desperate request for work without so much as a second look at him. Then Lily reached for her mother's hand and whispered something that seemed to stop the whole building from breathing. "Mom, that's my dad." That morning had opened under a clear spring sky, sunlight pouring over the towers of downtown Ashford and turning the windows of Cross Dynamics to gold. Vivian arrived at exactly 8 o'clock in a black sedan, dressed in an ivory suit that looked untouched by the world outside it. At 38, she'd built one of the country's largest medical technology companies out of the wreckage of her father's failing lab. Business magazines praised her discipline, investors feared her silence, employees joked she could sense weakness before a person even walked into the room. Almost no one knew that behind the private elevators and the guarded penthouse, Vivian lived with a fear no amount of money could touch. Her daughter had stopped trusting the world. Lily flinched from strangers, cried whenever her mother was gone more than a few hours, and kept asking about the father she'd never met. Vivian always gave the same answer: he vanished before she was born, he chose another life, he wasn't coming back. Across the city, Daniel Hayes was helping his 8-year-old son, Milo, button a school shirt missing a cuff. Their apartment sat above a shuttered laundromat, in a neighborhood where delivery trucks rattled the windows from sunrise to dusk. The fridge held half a carton of milk, 3 eggs, and a jar of mustard. An unopened notice from the landlord sat on the table. Daniel already knew what it said. He was 6 weeks behind on rent. For 3 years he'd raised Milo alone, since the boy's mother died from complications after heart surgery. Daniel had once been a respected biomedical engineer with a real career ahead of him, but after her death he'd walked away from conference rooms and patents to care for his grieving son. By the time he tried to come back, the industry had moved on and his damaged reputation followed him everywhere. People remembered the investigation at Cross Dynamics, the missing research data, the accusation that he'd tried to steal a prototype. What they didn't remember was that the case had been quietly dropped. What they never knew was that he'd never been given a chance to defend himself. Daniel had applied to Cross Dynamics 17 times. Every application disappeared without a word back. That morning, he decided paper wasn't enough anymore. After walking Milo to school, he took a bus downtown with his last resume, a few recommendation letters, and a small silver photograph tucked into the folder. He'd promised Milo he'd come home with good news. He said it smiling, even though he had $9 left in his wallet. The Cross Dynamics lobby was bigger than the public library in Daniel's neighborhood. Sunlight spilled through a 40-foot glass ceiling onto pale stone floors and steel sculptures shaped like human hearts. Daniel stood among the badge-swiping visitors in scuffed shoes, aware of every frayed thread on his sleeves. He explained he had no appointment, just needed 5 minutes with someone in engineering. The receptionist's polite smile hardened the moment she typed his name. A security flag popped up: former contractor, restricted access. 2 guards approached. Daniel tried to stay calm, explaining there'd been a misunderstanding years ago, that he only wanted to submit proof of his innocence. But his voice carried further than he meant it to, and people started staring. When a guard took his arm, the folder fell open and papers scattered across the floor. At that exact moment, Vivian stepped out of the private elevator with 3 executives and Lily at her side. The girl was there because school was closed for a teacher conference, and Vivian had promised they'd have lunch together. Vivian noticed the commotion and immediately recognized the surname. It belonged to the most dangerous scandal in her company's history, one her late father had buried himself. She didn't recognize the face, though, because 12 years earlier she'd known him under a different name. As Daniel knelt to gather his pages, Vivian stopped a few feet away and asked, in a voice quiet but sharp as a slammed door, why a restricted individual was still in the building. Daniel looked up, and for a heartbeat, they both froze. Something flickered behind Vivian's expression, a memory she pushed down instantly. Daniel stared at the woman he'd once loved and realized she truly didn't know him at all. Years before Cross Dynamics existed, Vivian had spent one summer volunteering at a rural clinic under her middle name, Eve Lawson, trying to escape her controlling father and find out if she could build something real without the Cross name attached. Daniel had been the young engineer fixing medical equipment there. They fell in love in crowded hallways, over broken generators, through long sunlit afternoons. Vivian never told him she was heir to a fortune. Daniel never told her his own father was dying and that he'd soon have to leave the city to care for him. Their relationship ended in confusion after Vivian's father found out. He intercepted their letters, threatened Daniel's career, and convinced each of them the other had simply walked away. Daniel searched for Eve for months and never found her. He didn't learn she was Vivian Cross until years later, seeing her photo in a business article. By then he was married, Milo was a baby, and he believed that Summer belonged to another life. He had no idea she'd been pregnant when they were torn apart. So in the lobby that morning, Vivian saw only a man tied to betrayal. Her father had told her Daniel stole research, played on her feelings, and tried to use their relationship to get into the family company, and she believed it, because believing the lie hurt less than accepting that someone she loved had simply disappeared without a word. Daniel tried to explain he had evidence about the old investigation. Vivian cut him off, saying Cross Dynamics didn't reward men who showed up uninvited expecting sympathy to substitute for qualifications. Her eyes flicked once over his worn clothes and cheap folder. She told security to remove him and never come back. It stung worse because Lily was watching. Daniel gathered the last of his papers, stood, and accepted that this door was closed for good. As he turned to leave, the photograph slipped free and slid across the marble, stopping near Lily's shoe. It had been taken 12 years earlier outside that rural clinic, Daniel standing beside a younger Vivian under a flowering tree, she in a simple yellow dress, laughing into the camera, his hand in hers. On the back, in Vivian's own handwriting, "For the man who made me believe I could have a life of my own." Lily picked it up. She stared at her mother's younger face, then at Daniel. For years she kept a hidden sketch in her bedroom drawer copied from a photo she'd once found in her grandmother's attic, showing the same man beside her mother. When she'd asked who he was, her grandmother had torn the photo away and said he was no one. Now Lily's small fingers tightened around the picture. Something certain moved through her. She crossed the lobby toward the dining room where lunch was waiting, but she kept glancing back at him. Vivian followed, unsettled. Daniel was nearly at the revolving doors when Lily dropped her spoon, grabbed her mother's hand, and whispered, "Mom, that's my dad." The room seemed to tilt around Vivian. She crouched down and asked what she meant. Lily held up the photograph and explained she'd seen the same man before, hidden among old family things. That her grandmother once called him the mistake that almost ruined everything. Then she asked why the man in the photo had the same small crescent scar under his left eye that she saw in the mirror under her own. Vivian looked up. Daniel was almost outside. For the first time in her life, the CEO of Cross Dynamics ran, heels striking marble, employees stepping out of her way in shock. She reached the doors just as he crossed onto the sunlit plaza and called out his name. Not the one from the security file, but the one she'd used at the clinic. He stopped. The city kept moving around them, buses, ringing phones, fountains catching the light, but Vivian could hear only her own breathing. She held up the photograph and asked why he'd kept it. Daniel said it was the only proof that the happiest summer of his life had actually happened. Vivian said she'd written him letters. Daniel said he'd written dozens. Neither had ever received one. When Vivian asked if he'd known about Lily, Daniel's face changed. The question wounded him before he even understood it. He looked through the glass at the little girl inside, hand pressed to the window, and noticed the shape of her eyes, the tilt of her head, the same faint crescent scar under her eye. He whispered that he'd never known. The truth unraveled fast after that. Vivian canceled every meeting and brought Daniel into a private conference room. Not as an applicant this time, but as the man whose life her family's power had quietly rewritten. Legal archives were pulled. Old servers were searched. A retired assistant admitted Vivian's father had once ordered her to destroy personal letters. The original investigation showed Daniel had actually discovered a safety defect that would have delayed a major product launch, and instead of fixing it, an executive pinned the blame on him for accessing restricted files. That executive had since become Vivian's chief operations officer. Late that afternoon, sunlight lay across the conference table in long gold bars. Vivian had spent years believing Daniel abandoned her. Daniel had spent years believing she chose money over him. Between them sat a daughter who'd spent her whole life wondering why a father who never even knew she existed didn't want her. Lily came in quietly and set the old photograph down between them. She didn't ask complicated questions. She just moved close to Daniel and studied his hands, then pressed her small palm to his and smiled when their fingers lined up. That was when Daniel's composure broke. He lowered his head and cried, not loudly, but with the quiet grief of a man mourning every birthday, every fever, every first day of school he'd missed. Vivian watched him and understood, maybe for the first time, that money had shielded her from discomfort but never from loss. Her father's control had shaped her whole life, and without meaning to, she'd started treating people the way he'd treated Daniel, judging fast, trusting power, mistaking vulnerability for weakness. That morning she turned away a desperate man because of his clothes and an old rumor. By afternoon she knew he'd once given up his career to protect patients from a faulty device, and a paternity test soon confirmed what Lily had already known in her bones. Daniel was her father. None of it fixed everything overnight. Real life doesn't work that cleanly. Daniel still had Milo, a son afraid of being replaced. Vivian still carried years of distrust. Lily wanted Daniel close right away, while Daniel wrestled with guilt over loving a daughter he'd only just met. They started slow. Daniel came by the Crosshouse on weekend mornings. Lily showed him her drawings. Milo taught her how to fold paper airplanes. Vivian learned to sit at a kitchen table without checking her phone every 30 seconds. Some days were awkward. Some conversations ended in tears. But every honest moment mended something the old lies had broken. Vivian publicly cleared Daniel's name and fired the executive who'd framed him. She offered him a senior role, but he wouldn't take it as a handout. Instead, he pitched a design for affordable, portable heart monitoring units for underfunded clinics. Like the one where they'd first met. Cross Dynamics funded it, and Daniel ran the project on his own merit. Months later, the first units shipped to rural hospitals across the state. Daniel stood on a sunlit stage beside Vivian, Milo, and Lily. Reporters expected a standard corporate speech. Instead, Vivian admitted the company's best idea in years had started with a man she'd once silenced. And that real leadership wasn't about never making mistakes, but having the courage to face the harm they caused. Daniel didn't get rich overnight, and Vivian didn't become a different person in a day. But the poor single dad she'd once dismissed became the only person willing to challenge her without fearing her power. In time, respect turned into friendship, and eventually into something deeper, built not on young love, but on truth, patience, and forgiveness. Almost a year after that day in the lobby, on a bright Saturday morning, Vivian found Daniel in the garden helping Lily and Milo plant a young flowering tree, the same kind that had once stood outside the clinic. The kids packed soil around the roots while Daniel steadied the trunk. Vivian stepped into the sunlight, no assistance, no security, no board waiting on a decision. Lily took her mother's hand and placed it in Daniel's. That one small gesture held everything they'd lost, and everything they'd gotten back. The tree grew taller every season, its roots strengthening underground even when no one could see them, and that became the story of their family too. They weren't brought together because life had been fair to them. They were brought together because, after years of pain, they chose honesty over pride, forgiveness over blame, and love over fear. Vivian had once believed money could build walls strong enough to keep heartbreak out. In the end, it took a poor single father, a forgotten photograph, and a little girl's whisper to show her the truth. The most valuable things in life aren't the ones we own, but the people we're brave enough to recognize before it's too late.